Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something far more unsettling than knights and castles. Imagine a world where every meal could quietly kill you, where the kitchen itself was a smoky death trap, and where the secret ingredient in nearly everything was lead. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where chefs cooked with spoiled meat, moldy bread, and pots that slowly poisoned everyone at the table. The truth? You wouldn't last a single feast, and you're about to find out why. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news, you're not starving. At least not yet. The bad news, you're the cook. Your kitchen is not a tidy stone chamber with neat racks of utensils. It's a choking inferno. The air is thick with smoke that stings your eyes, firewood crackles under blackened cauldrons, and the floor is slick with spilled grease. Somewhere in the corner a chicken carcass is hanging upside down, buzzing with flies, waiting to be plucked, gutted, and maybe roasted if it doesn't rot first. The smell is unforgettable. A blend of sour ale, half-rancid fat, and meat that's 2 days past forgiveness. You reach for your tools, and here's the twist. Every single pot and pan is lined with lead. At first glance, it's shiny, heavy, and perfect for cooking, but over time, it slowly bleeds poison into everything you serve. The richer the meal, the more lead you inhale, sip, or chew. It's like adding a secret ingredient, only the secret is brain damage. Your bread, supposedly the safe option, isn't much better. Bakers often whiten loaves with chalk powder or ground bones to make them look more expensive. That means your daily bread doubles as construction material. Chewy, yes. Edible, technically. Digestible, debatable. And yet the recipes demand extravagance. Tonight you're supposed to serve something impressive. Maybe a hedgehog pie, baked whole until its spines crisp like skewers, or lampreys drowned in gallons of wine, a delicacy so oily it has to be smothered just to choke it down. Food here isn't about taste, it's about spectacle. The noble guests want something outrageous to brag about, and you're the poor soul tasked with making rotten ingredients look like royal cuisine. The kitchen itself feels like a punishment. Your wool tunic clings with sweat, your lungs burn with soot, and you're constantly one misstep away from collapsing into the fire pit. Yet, you keep stirring, basting, roasting, and hoping no one notices the faint green hue on the pork leg. Because here's the truth. In a medieval feast, every bite was a gamble. Spices weren't sprinkled to delight the palate. They were thrown in desperately to mask the stink of decay. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, not so much flavouring as medieval Febreze. The guests pretended to savour it, while secretly praying their bowels wouldn't betray them before the night was over. And as you wipe sweat from your brow, you realise the cruel joke. You're not cooking a meal, you're brewing a slow communal poisoning. But if you think the kitchen was dangerous, just wait until you see the banquet hall, where presentation was deadlier than the food itself. You stand at the market stalls, basket in hand, and you realise that survival begins here, with the food itself. The display looks colourful enough. Baskets of bread, strings of fish, haunches of meat hanging in the open air. But look closer, and the truth is far less appetising. There is no refrigeration, no sealed packaging, no health inspector with a clipboard. What you see is exactly what you get, and what you get is already halfway rotten. Flies swarm over the butcher's table, sinking into cuts of beef that shine with a faint green sheen. The fishmongers are still shouting about the freshness of their catch, though the smell says it washed ashore several days ago. You take what you can afford and tell yourself that boiling or roasting will surely make it safe. But the microorganisms multiplying inside do not share your optimism. Meat was one of the most dangerous gambles in the medieval diet. It was scarce, expensive, and a sign of wealth. For peasants, most meals were bread and porridge, but on rare occasions they got scraps of pork or beef. Wealthier households demanded grand roasts, entire animals brought to table with heads and tails intact. The problem was that meat spoiled quickly, especially in summer, and preservation methods were limited. Salting and smoking were the most common techniques, but both required enormous amounts of salt. In some years, salt was so valuable it was traded ounce for ounce with silver. That meant poorer households often skipped proper preservation entirely, relying on wishful thinking and fire to do the rest. Eating meat in the 14th century was less a luxury than a culinary dare. Dairy products carried their own hazards. Cheese and butter were staples in much of Europe, but without refrigeration they soured fast. Sour did not always stop people from eating them. In fact, recipes often embraced fermentation, whether intentional or accidental. Cheese crawling with maggots might be written off as simply aged. Butter that smelled off could be melted into a stew, its flavour hidden beneath onions and herbs. The logic was simple: waste nothing, eat everything, and hope your stomach was tougher than the food. Then there were the grains. At first glance, bread seemed like the safest choice. It was filling, versatile, and available to almost everyone. But even bread had teeth. Grain was stored in wooden bins or sacks, open to rodents, insects, and moisture. Rats chewed their way into granaries, leaving droppings behind. Dampness bred mould, and some moulds were more than unpleasant. The fungus ergot, which thrived on rye, produced toxic alkaloids that could trigger hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and even death. Entire villages were struck by outbreaks of what became known as St. Anthony's Fire, where people writhed in agony, their limbs blackening as blood vessels collapsed. Imagine sitting down for supper and ending the night by losing your toes. That was the hidden risk of every crust of rye bread. Spices were meant to save you, but even they came with a cost. Imported from distant lands, they travelled thousands of miles packed in sacks through damp ships and caravans. By the time they reached a medieval kitchen, peppercorns could be riddled with mould, saffron cut with worthless weeds, and cinnamon bulked up with ground bark. Counterfeiting was so widespread that entire guilds were formed just to test and regulate spice merchants. Still, people bought them anyway, because a pinch of something exotic could turn foul mutton into something faintly edible. The irony is that the very thing meant to protect you from spoiled food could itself be contaminated. If the food itself was not dangerous enough, the environment sealed the deal. Markets were rarely clean. Animals were slaughtered on the spot with blood pooling into the street. Offal was dumped into gutters, and dogs or pigs wandered freely snatching scraps. The smell of iron, bile, and dung mixed into the air you breathed with every bite. Even water, supposedly cleansing, carried risks. Wells and streams often ran beside cesspits, soaking up human waste into the same supply used for cooking. To drink water was to gamble with dysentery. No wonder ale and weak beer became everyday staples. Boiling during brewing made them safer than water, even if they left you in a permanent state of mild intoxication. Now picture yourself back in the kitchen, setting out your ingredients. A side of beef with a rainbow sheen, a sack of rye laced with ergot spores, and a block of cheese crawling slightly at the edges. You chop, stir, and roast with all the confidence of tradition. People did not cook this way because it was safe. They cooked this way because it was all they knew. And so each meal became a Russian roulette of medieval gastronomy. Eat, hope, pray, and repeat. The absurdity is how normalised it all was. People understood food could make them sick, but without germ theory, they did not understand why. Illness was blamed on bad air, imbalanced humours, or the wrath of God. Spoiled meat that made you vomit might be blamed on a curse or an unlucky star. Bread that triggered hallucinations could be seen as divine punishment or even possession. The lack of scientific explanation turned the dinner table into a theatre of superstition, where sickness became a moral failing rather than a microbial invasion. And as you chew your way through a tough, smoky hunk of pork, eyes watering from the burn of too much pepper, you realise something grim. This is not a feast. It is survival dressed up as tradition. Every ingredient carries a secret risk, and every bite is a reminder that the line between nourishment and poison was as thin as the edge of your knife. But food was only one half of the problem. The tools you used to prepare it were just as treacherous, quietly leaking toxins into everything you cooked. Your ingredients may already be questionable, but the tools you use to cook them are just as eager to finish you off. You reach for a pot, heavy and gleaming, and set it on the flames. What you don't realise is that this piece of cookware is not just a pot. It is a slow-acting weapon. In the Middle Ages, most kitchenware was made of lead, pewter, or copper. They looked beautiful when polished, solid, and dependable. But with every simmer and boil, tiny fragments of metal leached into the stew. Lead in particular was the invisible killer. It was prized for its softness, easy to shape into plates, mugs, and cooking vessels. Unfortunately, it also built up silently in the body. Headaches, madness, infertility, gout, and eventual collapse were the rewards for years of fine dining. Wealthy households, with their elaborate banquets and endless jugs of wine, took in the highest doses. Being rich in the Middle Ages did not just mean more food, it meant more poison. Pewter carried the same curse. Early pewter was not the relatively safe alloy you might picture today. It was a blend of tin and lead, and sometimes the lead content was higher than the tin. Drinking from a pewter mug was like taking tiny doses of heavy metal every evening. Add wine into the equation, its natural acidity drawing even more lead into the liquid, and the effect intensified. Historians have even suggested that centuries of lead exposure in European elites contributed to the chronic illnesses of kings, queens, and nobility. The madness of rulers, the unpredictability of courts, the sudden deaths of heirs, all could be traced back to the dining table where the poison was baked right in. Copper pots were not innocent either. Copper is essential to human health in trace amounts, but when heated with acidic foods like vinegar, wine, or fruit, it released toxic levels. The results were nausea, vomiting, and a particularly painful form of food poisoning. The worst part is that cooks believed copper added a pleasant brightness to flavours. A medieval fruit preserve simmering in a copper pan looked vibrant and glossy, but that shine came with a price. What looked appetising could easily send an entire household to the privy in agony. Even pottery had its dangers. Glazes used on ceramic jugs, bowls and pitchers were often lead-based to achieve that attractive glossy finish. Liquids stored inside these vessels absorbed the lead slowly, becoming more dangerous the longer they sat. Water, ale and wine all transformed into silent toxins with each passing day. Archaeological digs reveal that shards of medieval pottery often contained significant traces of lead, a lingering reminder that every sip came with a dose of something no one bargained for. Knives and cutting boards created their own hazards. A medieval cook's knife was not stainless steel but iron, which rusted quickly. Keeping blades sharp and clean was a constant struggle. Rust and microscopic flakes of iron could find their way into every chop of onion or slice of pork. Wooden cutting boards, scored with deep grooves from years of use, became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Without soap or disinfectant, rinsing them in cold water did little more than spread the contamination around. The idea of cross-contamination would not be discovered for centuries. Yet in every kitchen, raw meat, fish, and vegetables all mingled on the same scarred surface, turning every meal into an experiment in microbial roulette. The oven and hearth themselves were dangerous environments. Smoke from open fires filled the kitchen, coating walls, ceilings, and lungs with soot. Chronic smoke inhalation led to respiratory diseases, inflamed eyes, and persistent coughs. Cooking meant hours spent leaning over billowing flames, breathing air that was half ash, half grease, and entirely destructive. In some large kitchens, the smoke became so dense that workers tied cloths around their faces, though these offered little real protection. Modern studies suggest that medieval cooks endured smoke exposure equivalent to heavy urban pollution, or even smoking several packs of cigarettes a day. You weren't just poisoning others with your cooking, you were poisoning yourself simply by showing up to work. Every tool of the trade came with consequences. To prepare a feast, you poisoned the food with lead from the pot, rust from the knife, and soot from the fire. To serve it, you poured ale into a pewter cup that quietly leaked more toxins into the drink. To store it, you placed it in glazed pottery that seeped lead overnight. And when the meal reached the table, the cycle continued. Guests congratulated themselves on the abundance, never realizing that the true banquet was for the metals accumulating in their bloodstreams. The absurdity lies in how highly these materials were valued. Pewter cups were heirlooms, copper pots were prized possessions, pottery with glossy glazes was a sign of refinement. The very objects that slowly dismantled bodies were treasured as marks of prosperity and taste. Safety was not part of the calculation. Durability and appearance mattered far more. Poison disguised as luxury. That was the true medieval kitchen aesthetic. And yet, people adapted. They endured headaches, stomach cramps, and fevers without ever connecting them to their cookware. Physicians prescribed herbs, charms, and purgatives, treating symptoms without identifying causes. Illness was blamed on the imbalance of humours, not the lead in the pot or the copper in the pan. In this way, the silent poisoning continued for generations, hiding in plain sight, woven into the very act of eating itself. You wipe soot from your brow, your lungs roar from hours over the fire, and you ladle stew into a pewter bowl. The food smells faintly metallic, but no one questions it. They call it hearty. They call it nourishing. They call it dinner. And you realise that in this kitchen, survival is not about hunger. It is about how slowly you can be poisoned before your work consumes you completely. The feast has not even begun, but the guests are already in danger. Not from what you cooked, but from how it will be served and displayed once it leaves your hands. The food leaves the kitchen at last, steaming in pewter dishes and ceramic bowls, carried into the banquet hall where the true performance begins. This is no quiet supper. This is theatre. The guests are seated on long wooden benches at trestle tables that creak under the weight of platters piled with roasted meats, spiced stews, and pies big enough to bury a child. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and roasted goose fat. The firelight flickers off goblets, knives, and greasy fingers. You would think this is the safer part of the process, after the hazards of sourcing and cooking. But the feast itself is just another layer of danger, dressed up in ceremony. Serving customs often guaranteed contamination before a single bite was taken. Hand-washing bowls were sometimes offered before the meal, but soap was rare and the water was reused for multiple guests. Imagine dipping your fingers into the same greasy basin as half a dozen nobles who just spent the day hunting with hawks and dogs. It was less hygiene and more symbolic gesture, a theatrical nod to cleanliness without the results. After this perfunctory rinse, everyone tore into food with their bare hands, passing platters back and forth, double dipping, coughing, sneezing, and licking their fingers before grabbing more. Germ theory was centuries away, so no one thought twice about it. Illness spread invisibly with every shared bite. Then there was the tradition of communal drinking. A large goblet of ale or wine might be passed down the table, each person taking a sip before handing it on. The richer households might have multiple goblets, but the practice remained the same. Saliva mingled, microbes transferred freely, and any sickness harboured by one guest became a gift for the next. It was considered a mark of fellowship, a ritual of togetherness. In reality, it was the medieval version of a flu convention. One toast, one sip, and suddenly half the table was infected. Even the entertainment was a hazard. Dishes were often disguised or constructed in ways that made them dangerously impractical. Pastries shaped into castles, pies filled with live birds that burst out when the crust was cut, roasts decorated with feathers or gilded with toxic metals like mercury and arsenic to give them a shimmering, otherworldly appearance. These spectacles delighted diners and impressed guests with their extravagance, but many of the coatings and dyes were poisonous. Gold leaf was edible in tiny amounts, but arsenic and mercury most certainly were not. Yet cooks used them freely, dusting meats and candies with bright powders to dazzle the eyes. Eating a slice of this artistry meant swallowing more than flavour. It meant swallowing the medieval equivalent of a chemical experiment. The carving ritual introduced its own hazards. At grand tables, a trained carver sliced meat in front of the guests, often using elaborate gestures and flourishes to display skill. The knife was sharp, the meat not always fully cooked, and juices splattered across the table, soaking into bread trenchers and mixing with everything nearby. Those trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates, absorbed grease and blood before being eaten or thrown to servants and beggars waiting outside. Nothing was wasted, not even the juices that carried bacteria. The trenchers themselves often sat out for hours before being consumed, collecting flies and mould before reaching the mouths of the poor. Food poisoning was so common it became a part of everyday life. Physicians wrote about surfeit, an illness caused by overeating at banquets, but what they were often describing was foodborne illness. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever and weakness struck down nobles and peasants alike, and no one made the connection between undercooked lampreys or gilded pheasants and their misery. Instead, blame was cast on gluttony, divine wrath, or the imbalance of the humours. Doctors might prescribe bloodletting or herbal purges, which did little to treat the real cause. The banquet hall became both a stage for excess and a breeding ground for sickness. And then there was the drink. Wine and ale were consumed in astonishing quantities, partly because water was unsafe, but also because intoxication was expected. But alcohol was rarely pure. Ale might be brewed with contaminated water, wine might be stored in lead-lined casks, and both were frequently adulterated. Tavern keepers and merchants watered down their stock or added dangerous flavourings to stretch supplies. Lead acetate, also known as sugar of lead, was sometimes used to sweeten sour wine, making it taste smoother while slowly destroying kidneys and brains. Guests praised the flavour, never knowing they were sipping a slow-acting poison with every toast. Hygiene during and after the meal was virtually non-existent. Bones, scraps and leftover grease were tossed to the floor, where dogs and pigs snuffled around underfoot. Guests spat freely, wiped greasy fingers on tablecloths or tunics, and left behind heaps of refuse. The banquet hall floor became a carpet of bones, shells and spills, ground into the rushes that were supposed to absorb the mess. Rushes were rarely changed, often only refreshed with a scattering of new ones on top, so layers of rotting food, animal waste and spilled drink built up over months. The stench rose from underfoot, mingling with the smoke above, creating an atmosphere where breathing was an act of bravery. You take a seat at the feast, your trencher soaking with the juices of undercooked venison, and raise a communal cup of wine sweetened with something suspicious. The music plays, the guests laugh, and you realise the banquet is not just a meal. It is a carnival of hazards, every ritual and tradition turning food into danger disguised as celebration. The pageantry is only the beginning, for the true peril lurks in the leftovers, in how food was stored, handled and resurrected long after the feast was over. The banquet winds down, the torches burn low, and the tables are a battlefield of greasy bones, half-eaten pies, and trenchers sagging with juices. The nobles stagger away to collapse in their chambers, but your work is not done. The feast has ended, but the food is far from finished. In fact, in the Middle Ages, leftovers weren't waste. They were treasure. Every scrap was destined to be reused, reheated and recycled until it no longer resembled food so much as a biological experiment. Refrigeration didn't exist, so storage meant leaving things where they landed. Meat pies and roasts might sit out overnight in the draughty hall, still warm in the centre, their crusts slowly crawling with bacteria invisible to the medieval eye. In summer, flies claimed them within hours, laying eggs that hatched into a squirming garnish by morning. But nothing was thrown away. Yesterday's venison became tomorrow's stew. The stew simmered again, stretched with turnips or onions, and by the third day it might be so sour that spices were dumped in by the handful to disguise it. Food safety was not a category. Edibility was judged on smell alone, and sometimes not even that. Even bread, the most basic staple, was rarely eaten fresh unless you were wealthy. Peasants relied on coarse loaves that hardened within a day, turning into rock-like slabs. Instead of discarding them, they were soaked in broth, beer, or wine until soft enough to chew again. Those trenchers from the feast, soaked in juices, grease, and sometimes blood, were collected and either eaten later or distributed to the poor. By the time they were consumed, they had spent hours collecting bacteria, mold, and animal droppings from the hall floor. Charity was noble in intention, but in reality it was a handout of stomach cramps. Fish carried even worse risks. Salted or dried fish was a common commodity, especially during fast days when meat was forbidden, but improper storage could turn it toxic. Barrels of herring or cod were shipped inland, sometimes arriving so foul that even contemporary records admit they stank. Yet cooks were expected to serve them anyway. Rehydrated, spiced and stewed, they became part of the diet whether safe or not. In some cases, salted fish was so heavily packed that layers rotted from the inside while the outside seemed edible. Eating it was an act of faith in salt alone. Dairy was equally treacherous. Butter and cheese were preserved forms of milk, but they soured quickly if stored poorly. Medieval kitchens didn't have sterile jars or plastic wrapping. Instead, butter might be sealed in crocks with brine or buried in cool cellars. Cheese matured in open air, often in rooms where insects and rodents had free access. A wheel of cheese could be crawling with life and still considered consumable. In fact, there were cases where maggots were simply regarded as a natural part of the cheese-making process. It was eaten anyway, with the logic that if the creatures could survive inside it, so could you. Wine and ale also turned toxic in storage. Ale was brewed to be drunk quickly, usually within days, because without hops it spoiled fast. Left too long, it soured into vinegar or grew thick with floating clumps of yeast. Wine might be stored longer, but barrels were often lined with lead to sweeten and preserve the liquid. That meant every glass poured days or weeks after the feast carried a dose of lead acetate. The longer it sat, the stronger the effect. By the end of winter, noble households weren't just drinking wine, they were drinking a liquid heavy metal cocktail. The way food was handled didn't help either. Servants carried leftovers from hall to kitchen, often with filthy hands, dropping scraps onto the rushes before placing them back onto plates. Rats and mice darted freely through pantries, leaving droppings in flour sacks and gnawing on meat stores. Cats and dogs sometimes helped by hunting vermin, but they also left their own contributions behind. Food was as much for the animals as it was for the humans, and the lines between kitchen and stable blurred constantly. The superstition of the time also encouraged dangerous practices. People believed strongly in the concept of reusing food until it lost its virtue. Broths were kept simmering for days, with new ingredients added continually until the pot became a perpetual stew. Families might dip into the same pot morning and night, topping it off with whatever scraps were available. The longer it lasted, the richer the flavour, but also the higher the bacterial load. Some stews may have been kept going for weeks. Imagine a pot of leftovers dating back to the beginning of the month, reheated daily, thickened with grease, and eaten by the entire household. That was not an accident. That was the system. Illnesses linked to spoiled food were common but misunderstood. Diarrhea, cramps and fever might be blamed on imbalanced humours, or the phases of the moon, not yesterday's pie that spent the night on the table. Physicians prescribed purging, bleeding or herbal concoctions, but never addressed the fact that reheated venison stew had been left open to flies. In monasteries, chronic outbreaks of illness were sometimes attributed to sin or sloth, when the real culprit was the kitchen routine of recycling old food until it could barely be identified. The irony is that some of the poor may have fared better. Peasants ate simpler fare, with fewer rich meats and decadent stews, which meant fewer opportunities for foodborne pathogens to thrive. But when peasants did get access to leftovers from nobles, It often came in the form of trenchers soaked in contaminated juices or half-spoiled meat sent as alms. Charity in that sense could be lethal. You glance at the pantry where slabs of salted beef hang, covered in a thin film of mould, and barrels of fish ooze brine onto the floor, jugs of ale fizz with sourness, and the perpetual stew bubbles faintly in the corner, thick with mysterious lumps. To the medieval mind, this was abundance, proof of survival through scarcity. To a modern eye, it is nothing short of a slow-moving catastrophe. Every mouthful extends the risk. Every day brings new layers of rot disguised as sustenance. The meal never truly ends here. It lingers, it festers, and it waits for the next unsuspecting bite. The banquet may dazzle in the moment, but the real danger is in the days that follow, when leftovers are resurrected again and again until survival itself feels like a miracle. And as you ladle another portion of perpetual stew, hoping the spices are strong enough to mask the sourness, you realise the poison doesn't stop at the table or the pantry. It follows you all the way into the rituals of preservation, where entire traditions were built around techniques that carried their own hidden dangers. You stand in the pantry now, where survival was meant to be engineered through preservation. Fresh food was a fleeting luxury, gone within days. So cooks turned to the methods they believed would extend its life. Salting, smoking, pickling and curing were the medieval answers to refrigeration, and they worked well enough to keep hunger at bay. Yet each came with its own subtle venom, transforming meals into long-term hazards wrapped in tradition. Salt was the cornerstone of preservation, so precious it was nicknamed white gold. Great slabs of meat and barrels of fish were packed in salt, until the crystals hardened into armour around the flesh. In theory, this kept rot away. In practice, salt was not always pure. Harvested from coastal pans or mined from rock deposits, it could be contaminated with sand, clay and other minerals. The sheer quantity required meant people consumed staggering amounts of sodium, far beyond what the body could handle comfortably. The result was chronic dehydration, kidney strain, and a bloated population that considered thirst normal. Too much salt damaged arteries and hearts, yet medieval cooks never hesitated to pile it on. When winter stores ran low, desperate households sometimes reused the brine from old barrels, creating a broth teeming with bacteria but still ladled over meat. Smoking was another staple method, with chambers designed to hang meat and fish above smouldering fires. The smoke gave flavour and dried the flesh, but it also coated everything with tar and carcinogenic compounds. Medieval cooks had no concept of carcinogens, but the constant exposure to smoked foods left lungs irritated and stomachs troubled. The smoke itself filled kitchens and homes, blackening ceilings and leaving soot in every breath. Families lived in this atmosphere year-round, inhaling more than enough to scar lungs permanently. Preservation may have extended the life of the food, but it also shortened the lives of the people eating and cooking it. Pickling and brining offered different dangers. Vegetables, eggs, and even meats were stored in vats of vinegar or sour wine, submerged for months. Acidity delayed spoilage, but the containers often leaked toxins. Wooden barrels harboured mould and bacteria. Clay jars, glazed with lead, infused the pickles with heavy metals. What was supposed to be a safe store of vegetables for winter instead became a cocktail of vinegar, rot, and lead, disguised as nutrition. Even more concerning was the lack of uniform recipes. Some cooks added herbs that had toxic properties, believing they aided digestion. In reality, they added another risk layer to an already precarious meal. Fermentation was not just about flavour, it was about survival. Bread, beer, and cheese all relied on microbial processes, but without controlled conditions they often spiralled out of balance. Beer brewed in warm weather turned sour quickly, creating stomach-churning concoctions. Cheese left to ripen too long became breeding grounds for dangerous moulds. Bread dough might ferment unevenly, creating pockets of bacteria. People ate it anyway, sometimes praising the strong flavours that were actually signs of contamination. The line between clever food science and slow poisoning was razor thin, and in the medieval kitchen it was crossed daily. Even drying, the simplest method, came with pitfalls. Meat and fish hung outdoors were exposed to insects and animals, their surfaces crawling with larvae long before storage. Grains dried in the open air collected spores that could later trigger illness. Once dried, the foods were stacked in storerooms that were anything but sterile. Rats, mice, and insects invaded freely, leaving behind waste. By the time the food was cooked again, it was infused with contaminants invisible to the medieval eye. Preservation methods reflected a constant battle against time. The longer food could last, the greater the chance a family would survive a harsh winter. Yet every layer of preservation came with its own form of poisoning. High salt damaged the body slowly. Smoke filled lungs. Vinegar in lead jars poisoned silently. Fermentation sometimes tipped into rot. It was not a question of if someone became sick, but when. The irony was that these methods were seen as gifts of ingenuity. Cooks and households who mastered preservation were praised. Villages relied on them. Winter survival depended on stored meat, salted fish, and pickled vegetables. Yet behind every congratulation lurked the reality that survival often meant trading immediate starvation for long-term sickness. To live through the winter was an achievement. To emerge healthy was nearly miraculous. You open a barrel of salted herring, the smell so pungent it burns your nostrils, and scoop out a fish coated in brine reused from months ago. You carry it to the hearth, where smoke has already blackened the ceiling and burned your eyes. The fish will be fried in a pan that leaks lead, seasoned with spices that may be counterfeit, and served on bread laced with ergot. Every step of the process, from preservation to preparation, is another invitation to illness, and still it is celebrated as resourceful. The preserved food that sustained life also undermined it, turning necessity into hazard. And as the centuries rolled on, cooks learned not to question these traditions. Instead, they doubled down, convinced that preservation was a triumph over nature rather than a pact with poison. The jars, barrels, and smokehouses around you stand as proof that ingenuity in the Middle Ages came with a hidden price. You're not just feeding a family, you're building a slow poison cabinet, one salted fish and smoked ham at a time. And while the pantry may be dangerous, the real risks only multiply when you turn your attention to the medicines and cures that cooks and households trusted to undo the damage, many of which carried poisons far more potent than the food itself. The moment the stew curdles in your stomach, you know the remedies will follow. The medieval kitchen did not stop at feeding. It doubled as a pharmacy. Every herb, spice, and concoction was believed to carry healing powers, but in practice the cures often made the illness worse. If dinner poisoned you, the medicine waiting in the pantry was more than capable of finishing the job. Herbs were the first line of defense. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and parsley were sprinkled not only for flavor, but for their supposed medicinal qualities. A fever from spoiled venison might be treated with a broth heavy in sage, believed to cleanse the blood. Garlic was praised for driving away infection and even evil spirits, so it was consumed raw in large quantities. While garlic does have antibacterial properties, medieval cooks took the idea so literally that patients often ended up with blistered stomachs and unbearable breath, neither of which solved the original poisoning. Spices imported at great cost were also pressed into medical service. Cinnamon was prescribed for stomach cramps, cloves for toothaches, and nutmeg for fevers. But these were not measured in careful doses. They were heaped into broths and wines, sometimes mixed with questionable carriers like spoiled honey or sour wine. The result was a medicine cabinet that looked and tasted like a banquet, only with side effects just as alarming as the illnesses it was meant to cure. Too much nutmeg, for example, is hallucinogenic and in large doses toxic. A patient who had eaten spoiled fish might then be given a draught of nutmeg wine strong enough to send them spinning into delirium. Alcohol itself was one of the most common cures. Ale and wine were considered cleansing, capable of flushing out corruption in the body. Physicians prescribed medicated wines, steeped with herbs or resins for nearly every ailment. If you vomited after a banquet, you might be handed a cup of spiced wine to settle your stomach. In reality, the acidity and alcohol often made the irritation worse. Some brews were laced with dangerous additives. Lead acetate, the sugar of lead sometimes used to sweeten sour wine, turned up in these remedies too. The cure and the cause were indistinguishable, each a slow erosion of the body. More extreme treatments were reserved for those who could afford them. Physicians advised purging poisons with emetics or laxatives, often made from plants with powerful toxins of their own. Hellebore, a poisonous root, was sometimes administered to force vomiting. Colocynth, a bitter gourd, caused violent diarrhea. Even mercury was prescribed in certain contexts, rubbed on the skin or swallowed in tiny doses to balance humours. The patient might indeed expel the contents of their stomach, but only because the cure was stripping the body apart. In a medieval kitchen, the medicine chest was a row of jars filled with substances that modern toxicology textbooks list as lethal. The logic of the time followed humoral theory, where illness came from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Food poisoning, fevers or cramps were seen not as microbial invasions, but as signs of imbalance. The remedies aimed to restore harmony, which meant bleeding, vomiting, sweating or purging until the body was drained. The kitchen supplied the tools. Broths were laced with diuretics, teas brewed with laxatives, ointments made from lead-based powders. The patient might survive the original spoiled dish, only to succumb to the treatment meant to save them. Even baths and fumes were considered medicinal. Cooks boiled herbs in pots, creating steam inhalations to clear the lungs or purify the head. Unfortunately, many of these herbs contained compounds that irritated eyes and airways. Some included toxic plants like henbane or mandrake, whose fumes caused dizziness and hallucinations. Patients sat sweating over steaming bowls, convinced they were drawing poison out of their system, while in reality they were poisoning themselves further through inhalation. Honey and vinegar were two of the most common household cures, but even they turned dangerous in practice. Honey, often used to coat pills or sweeten tonics, was harvested from hives exposed to toxic plants. Bees that gathered nectar from rhododendrons or oleander produced honey laced with natural poisons. Vinegar, meanwhile, was stored in lead-glazed pottery, leaching toxins as it aged. When honey and vinegar were combined into oxymel, a syrup recommended for sore throats and stomach troubles, it became a sweetened poison that patients swallowed in faith. Superstition only complicated matters. Charms and powders were mixed into food or drink, thought to carry protective properties. Crushed gemstones, for instance, were sometimes added to wine as antidotes to poison. The practice destroyed expensive jewels while adding nothing but grit to the drink. In some cases, the gemstones themselves contained harmful minerals. Medieval medicine was less about science than spectacle, and patients paid dearly for the illusion of healing. You sipped the so-called remedy, a steaming wine spiked with herbs and honey, and feel your stomach churn again. The original spoiled stew lingers in your gut, but now you've added nutmeg hallucinations, lead glaze, and the faint burn of hellebore. The treatment has become its own trial, no less dangerous than the food that sent you here. For the medieval chef, poisoning didn't end when the plates were cleared. It continued in the kitchen pharmacy, where every cure was another risk and every attempt at healing was another chance at harm. The cycle of food and medicine blurred together, each poisoning feeding into the next. You prepared meals with dangerous ingredients, served them with toxic tools, preserved them with hazardous methods, and cured the consequences with poisonous remedies. The kitchen was not just a place of nourishment, it was an ecosystem of risk. And as you place the jars of herbs and powders back on their shelf, you know the dangers will not stop here. For beyond food and medicine lies the ritual of fasting and feasting itself, traditions that demanded extremes of eating and abstaining, each carrying their own hidden poisons. The calendar itself was another accomplice in the poisoning game. In the medieval world, food was not just about hunger, it was about rules, rituals, and religion. The church dictated much of what and when people could eat, and as a chef, your life revolved around these cycles. Feasts followed fasts, indulgence followed abstinence, and each swing of the pendulum created new risks. Survival was never steady. It lurched between extremes that battered the body almost as much as the food itself. Fasting was not a suggestion, it was law. Entire seasons of the year, especially Lent, demanded abstinence from meat and animal products. That meant no beef, pork, poultry, butter, or eggs. Fish became the primary replacement, and with it came hazards of its own. Oceans and rivers could not always supply enough fresh catch, so preserved fish dominated the diet. Salted herring and dried cod filled barrels stacked high in markets. But these fish often rotted in transit, their salty hides concealing decay inside. Monasteries and noble kitchens relied on them anyway, soaking and cooking them repeatedly until the texture turned leathery and the smell unbearable. Eating spoiled fish was not an accident during fasting, it was routine. Fasting also encouraged inventive substitutions that turned meals into experiments. Almond milk, made by grinding nuts with water, replaced dairy. It was nutritious enough but spoiled rapidly, especially in warmer weather, and often carried mould. Pea and bean pastes were formed into mock cheeses, which fermented unpredictably. Cooks attempted to mimic the richness of meat with vegetables soaked in strong spices, but the seasonings themselves were often adulterated or contaminated. What was supposed to be spiritual purification became a test of gastrointestinal endurance. Feast days, by contrast, were indulgent to the point of danger. The sudden transition from weeks of sparse meals to a table groaning with meats, pies and wines was more than many bodies could handle. Overeating was a badge of honour, but it carried predictable results. Physicians described surfeiting, a condition of bloating, cramps and vomiting after excessive banqueting. In truth, it was mass food poisoning, worsened by the sheer volume consumed. People went from salted herring to spiced venison in a single day, flooding their systems with bacteria, toxins and fat. The digestive system staggered under the whiplash, and the next morning's remedies only compounded the misery. Even the rules of what counted as fasting created absurdities that endangered health. Waterfowl such as geese, ducks, and even beavers were classified by church authorities as fish because they lived in or near water. This meant their oily, heavy meat was consumed in great quantities during fast days, especially in monasteries. The misclassification allowed rich, fatty meals to replace lean proteins, defeating the spiritual purpose while overwhelming the body with cholesterol and grease. A monk abstaining from beef might instead devour a roasted beaver tail, congratulating himself on piety while courting heart failure. In wealthier courts, fasting inspired bizarre culinary experiments. Chefs created elaborate mock meats, pies sculpted into the shape of animals, and dishes dyed with dangerous minerals to resemble forbidden foods. Some were decorated with verdigris, a green pigment scraped from copper, which was highly toxic. Guests marvelled at the artistry, unaware that the green glaze on their fasting dish was slowly corroding their insides. The intention was pious, the outcome was poisonous. The extremes of feast and fast also strained preservation methods. During long fasts, stores of fish, vegetables and grains were stretched to breaking point. By the end of Lent, what remained was often months old, sour and crawling with unseen life. At the end of fasting, nobles demanded instant abundance, forcing kitchens to prepare vast amounts of meat and pastry in a hurry, often undercooked or poorly managed. Both ends of the calendar delivered sickness, but in different flavours. One was the slow poison of rot, the other the sudden assault of gluttony. Monasteries provide some of the clearest evidence of this pattern. Strict fasting rules meant monks consumed extraordinary amounts of fish, bread, and weak ale, day after day, often of dubious quality. When feast days arrived, records show that monks regularly ate themselves into sickness, collapsing in dormitories after overindulgence. These same monasteries became centres of medical writing. where symptoms were carefully recorded without ever naming the obvious culprit. To them, illness was the price of devotion, not a sign that the food was unfit. You find yourself at the kitchen table preparing barrels of salted herring for the coming fast, already knowing the flesh inside is soft and sour. Weeks later, you will be asked to roast swans and bake pies stuffed with entire animals, the pendulum of the calendar swinging violently from restraint to indulgence. The rhythm is not balance, it is chaos disguised as ritual. Each shift magnifies the risks, and each tradition ensures that poisoning is built directly into the year. The medieval calendar was supposed to guide souls closer to God through discipline and celebration. Instead, it guided stomachs toward ruin. Every fast stripped the diet of variety and safety. Every feast drowned it in excess and contamination. The cycle repeated endlessly, grinding down bodies as predictably as the seasons. And as the bells ring out to mark the next holy day, you know that the dangers are not just in the kitchen or the pantry. They are woven into the very rhythm of time itself, forcing you to prepare meals that poison by design, feast or fast alike. The rules of religion may have dictated the meals, but the politics of power determined what was served to impress, intimidate, and dazzle, creating spectacles even more hazardous than the food itself. The holy calendar may have dictated when to eat, but politics decided how. Feasts were not just gatherings, they were weapons, carefully staged performances meant to show power, intimidate rivals, and cement alliances. As a chef, you weren't simply feeding guests. You were orchestrating a spectacle where food had to look impressive, even if it killed someone in the process. Political banquets demanded grandeur. Entire animals were roasted whole and carried into the hall, antlers, feathers, and hooves still attached, often redressed after cooking to appear alive again. Swans and peacocks were skinned before roasting, then refeathered once cooked. Their necks stiffened so they looked as if they were still watching the crowd. The meat beneath was greasy, gamey, and often undercooked to preserve its shape, but no one dared complain. The presentation mattered more than taste. Guests carved into the shimmering birds, sometimes gilded with thin sheets of gold or silver, consuming a glittering poison disguised as prestige. Gold and silver leaf, applied for beauty, passed through the body relatively harmless in small amounts, but many cooks went further. Dyes and powders were used to brighten dishes, and some of these were toxic. Copper salts created brilliant greens, but also corroded stomach linings. Mercury compounds gave a glossy shine, admired by nobles unaware that they were swallowing poison with their pudding. Bright colours equalled wealth, and poisoning was simply the cost of splendour. The sheer size of these displays also invited contamination. Imagine dozens of animals slaughtered, roasted and displayed in a hall, swarming with flies and dogs pacing under the tables. Meat sat for hours before it was served, cooling slowly, juices soaking into trenchers that would later be eaten by servants or beggars. The longer the ceremony stretched, the greater the microbial bloom. What began as a display of dominance often ended as a mass outbreak of sickness that no one could admit was caused by the feast itself. Food was also weaponized deliberately. Poisoning through food was a real and constant fear at political banquets. Tasting rituals were developed, where a servant sampled each dish before it reached the lord. Yet even this was not foolproof. A slow poison like arsenic might take hours or days to show its effects, far too late for the taster to save anyone. Chefs themselves were often suspected, forced to prepare food under watchful eyes to prevent tampering. The paranoia hung over every dish. Eating became a performance of trust as much as consumption. Feasts were also opportunities to show off exotic imports, and these were often the riskiest items on the table. Spices from Asia, sugar from the Mediterranean, citrus from the south, all travelled for weeks or months before arrival. Mould, contamination, and substitution were constant. Ground pepper might contain pebbles or powdered charcoal. Saffron was frequently faked with marigolds or dyed grasses. Sugar could be stretched with lime or chalk. These items dazzled the guests but also scratched teeth, poisoned stomachs, and mocked the idea of refinement. The sheer excess of banquets pushed bodies beyond their limits. Chronic overindulgence led to gout, famously called the disease of kings. Rich dishes heavy in meat, and wine flooded joints with uric acid crystals, leaving noblemen crippled. Yet gout was perversely worn as a badge of honour, proof that one lived well enough to indulge in luxuries that peasants could never touch. To suffer from swollen, agonising toes was considered almost fashionable, even as it marked a lifetime of dietary self-poisoning. For chefs, these political displays carried personal risk as well. Success meant prestige, but failure could mean punishment or even death. If a feast failed to impress, if the meat was spoiled, or if an important guest fell ill, suspicion fell on the kitchen. Cooks lived under the constant shadow of blame, accused of negligence or treachery. Some records mention chefs being fined, beaten, or dismissed for banquets gone wrong. The very act of preparing meals for the powerful placed you in a dangerous position, where the line between honour and ruin was as thin as the pastry on a gilded pie. The absurdity of these spectacles reached legendary heights. Records describe pies that opened to release live animals, doves, frogs, even rabbits, creating chaos in the hall. It was meant as entertainment, but the animals spread filth across the tables, contaminating food and dishes. Guests laughed at the spectacle while unwittingly dining in an environment even filthier than usual. A meal that should have showcased abundance turned into an accidental festival of contamination. You stand in the hall presenting a glittering swan, its feathers gleaming, its meat still pink beneath the skin. Nobles cheer, minstrels play, and the hall echoes with applause. Yet you know that every bite carries a risk. Every shimmering glaze hides toxins, and every passing goblet could carry poison. The feast is not nourishment. It is theatre, danger disguised as celebration, and survival depends as much on luck as on the food itself. The banquet might dazzle the powerful, but the risks continue long after the spectacle ends. For when the feasting is done, the kitchens must manage the enormous waste and the vermin it attracts, turning the very halls of power into breeding grounds for sickness. The last goblet has been drained, the musicians have gone quiet, and the nobles stagger back to their chambers, but for you the work has only shifted into another kind of hazard. The banquet hall, now stripped of its glamour, is a battlefield of scraps, bones, puddles of wine, and half-eaten pies collapsing under their own grease. This is where the real danger sets in, long after the toasts and the laughter. Waste management in the medieval world was less a system than an afterthought. Food scraps were tossed to the floor during the feast itself, trampled into the rushes, and left to rot where they lay. The rushes, meant to soak up spills, were rarely changed entirely. More often a thin layer of fresh straw was scattered over the top to disguise the layers of filth beneath. Months of bones, fat and waste built into a compost heap underfoot, a breeding ground for vermin. Guests might not notice while the music played, but the stench lingered and the danger multiplied. Rats were the first to arrive. They swarmed halls and kitchens alike, drawn to the abundance of grain, meat and grease. Rats were more than just a nuisance. They carried fleas that spread plague, and their droppings contaminated everything from flour sacks to wine barrels. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites shows rat bones in abundance, a reminder that they lived as permanent residents within human settlements. Kitchens were their paradise. They gnawed through storage barrels, chewed into hanging meats, and scurried across tables in the night. Every morning began with fresh contamination. Mice and other small rodents joined the invasion. Their droppings mingled with flour, leaving invisible traces that carried disease. Ingesting contaminated grain could cause outbreaks of food poisoning that no one could explain at the time. Bread made from infested flour looked normal, but carried toxins and pathogens. Entire villages could suffer from bread-related illness, without ever realizing that their daily staple was baked with rodent filth. Dogs and pigs roamed kitchens freely, cleaning scraps but adding their own mess in return. Pigs especially were kept close because they ate nearly anything. They consumed bones, fat and spoiled meat, but they also spread parasites like trichinella, which caused painful illness when humans ate infected pork later. Dogs licked trenchers, gnawed on leftovers, and then wandered through kitchens, spreading germs from their mouths and paws. The medieval habit of mixing animals and food preparation created a cycle of contamination that never ended. The waste itself posed further risks. Leftovers were not discarded so much as repurposed. Bones boiled for broth were often reused until brittle, leaching bacteria into the pot. Fat scraped from roasts was saved in jars and reused repeatedly, growing rancid but still used for frying. Grease spilled onto the floor soaked into rushes and furniture, turning kitchens into permanent stink chambers. Mould grew in corners, spores floating invisibly into every dish. The very air became part of the poison. Public refuse disposal was no better. In towns, kitchen waste was often dumped directly into streets or nearby rivers. Streets became open sewers, choked with bones, vegetable peelings and animal guts. Rain washed the mess into drinking water supplies, creating a loop of contamination. Cities like London attempted regulations, ordering butchers to dispose of offal outside the city walls, but enforcement was weak. The stench of decaying waste became as common as church bells, a background note to medieval life. The connection between waste and illness was poorly understood. Instead of associating vermin and filth with disease, people blamed bad air or divine wrath. Cooks swept rushes occasionally, sprinkled herbs to mask the smell and carried on. Rats scuttled across kitchens, dogs ate scraps, and pigs rooted through refuse, all while feasts continued as if nothing were wrong. The poison was not just in the food, but in the very environment where it was prepared. Parasites thrived in these conditions. Fleas, lice, and worms spread easily among both people and animals. Raw scraps fed to dogs or pigs perpetuated parasite cycles that returned to humans when meat was eaten later. Flies bred in waste piles and landed on uncovered food, spreading bacteria in seconds. In the absence of covered containers or refrigeration, every dish was exposed to this constant swarm. Guests might marvel at the sight of a golden pheasant, but behind the scenes it had already been seasoned with fly larvae. You step into the hall after the feast, the torches guttering low, and hear the rustle of rats in the rushes. Dogs gnaw bones in the corner while pigs root in piles of scraps. The floor squelches with grease under your boots. The smell a mix of sour ale, rot, and unwashed bodies. Tomorrow these same rooms will host another feast, with trenchers laid out on top of filth that has been building for months. Nothing is truly cleaned. Nothing is ever fresh. The poisoning does not pause between meals. It accumulates layer after layer until it feels less like dining and more like living inside a compost heap. The spectacle of the feast might have dazzled nobles, but the waste it created poisoned everyone equally. Vermin carried disease from kitchen to table, and scraps left to rot became new sources of infection. In the medieval world, waste was not disposed of. It was recycled into sickness, and as you scrape the last of the grease from the hall, you realise the danger doesn't stop with rats and waste. The very water you draw from the well, the lifeblood of the kitchen, carries poisons of its own, pulled from the same filth that surrounds you. You head to the well with a wooden bucket in hand because every dish begins with water. It should be the simplest ingredient, but in the Middle Ages it was one of the deadliest. The stream that runs through the village looks clear enough at first glance, but upstream it doubles as a dumping ground for chamber pots, animal carcasses, and every kind of waste imaginable. By the time it reaches your kitchen, it is less a source of life than a pipeline of disease, invisible and unstoppable. Wells were little safer. Dug deep into the ground, they often sat directly beside latrines or cesspits. Medieval towns were compact, crowded, and layered with filth, so human waste seeped into groundwater constantly. Archaeologists have found parasite eggs preserved in the soil near medieval wells, proof that water carried intestinal worms to every household. Cholera, dysentery and typhoid were all waiting in the bucket, though no one at the time could identify them. People judged water by appearance, not content. If it looked clear, it was assumed safe. Unfortunately, bacteria and parasites do not advertise their presence. Rivers, when used for drinking or cooking, carried the same curse. They were the highways of trade and also the dumping grounds of every industry. Tanneries poured chemicals and rotting hides into them. Butchers threw blood, offal and bones into the current. Fullers who cleaned wool with urine dumped their foul water back into the river. What flowed downstream was a soup of human and industrial waste. Cooks fetched it by the jug, boiled it for stews or broths, and assured themselves the heat would purify it. In reality, boiling helped, but never eliminated every threat, and water was rarely heated long enough to be safe. Storage methods made the problem worse. Water was kept in barrels lined with tar or lead. Tar gave a bitter taste, but lead sweetened the liquid, making it oddly pleasant. This sweet water was slowly poisoning everyone who drank it. Clay jugs glazed with lead carried the same problem, leaching toxins over time. Even if the well had been clean, the vessel guaranteed contamination by the time it reached the table. Because water was so risky, ale and weak beer became staples even for children. Brewing involved boiling, which killed some pathogens, and alcohol content added another layer of safety. Yet brewing was not a perfect shield. Ingredients could be spoiled, barrels infested with mold, and brewing equipment filthy. The resulting drink was safer than water, but still capable of causing stomach illness. Wine was similar. Imported in lead-lined casks, it carried heavy metals into noble households. A glass of wine at dinner was both a luxury and a dose of slow poison. The irony is that people did understand in a way that water made them sick. Medieval texts describe how drinking cold water could bring on cramps or fever, but without germ theory, the blame was misplaced. People believed water carried bad air, evil spirits, or imbalances in the humours. Physicians warned against drinking too much of it, recommending diluted wine or ale instead. Water was mistrusted, yet it remained essential, woven into cooking, baking and medicine. Even if avoided as a drink, it returned through every pot of broth, every boiled grain, every batch of bread dough. There was no escaping it. Diseases tied to contaminated water were some of the deadliest of the era. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, spread through armies, monasteries, and towns alike. Entire campaigns collapsed because soldiers drank fouled water from rivers or wells. Typhoid raged silently, carried in droplets no one could see. In cities, repeated outbreaks of diarrhea and fever decimated populations, yet no one connected it to the water running beneath their feet. The very act of living created the contamination, and the very act of cooking amplified it. You lower the bucket into the well, pull it up, and watch the clear surface glisten in the torchlight. To your eyes, it looks pure. To your body, it is a slow-acting curse. You pour it into the pot, mix it with questionable meat, and tell yourself the fire will make it safe. Yet the parasites, the heavy metals and the bacteria slip past the heat, entering every mouth at the table. No one blames the water. They blame the stars, the humours, or their own excess. The true culprit remains hidden, quietly poisoning households one sip at a time. The poisoned well is only one ingredient in the kitchen of hazards, for beyond the water lies the very fuel of the fire itself, wood and charcoal, which carried their own hidden dangers every time you lit the hearth. You crouch by the hearth, bucket of foul water in one hand and an armful of fuel in the other. To cook anything, you need fire. But fire in the Middle Ages was more than heat. It was a constant hazard, filling kitchens with choking smoke, toxic fumes, and invisible poisons that clung to every pot and every breath. Most fuel came from wood, but not all wood was equal. Hardwoods like oak or ash burned hotter and cleaner, but were expensive and sometimes scarce. poorer households turned to softwoods or green, damp wood that smouldered instead of burning. The result was a kitchen thick with acrid smoke that seeped into lungs and eyes. Chronic exposure led to coughing fits, inflamed lungs, and conditions we would now recognise as chronic bronchitis. Medieval cooks inhaled this every day, their bodies serving as filters for their own kitchens. Archaeologists have found blackened layers of soot on the ceilings of medieval homes, proof that generations lived in air equivalent to heavy industrial pollution. Charcoal offered more heat and less visible smoke, but came with its own dangers. It was produced by burning wood in low oxygen conditions, releasing carbon monoxide in the process. Cooks who worked in poorly ventilated kitchens risked poisoning themselves slowly, headaches turning into nausea, confusion, and eventual collapse. Records described servants and workers fainting near hearths or ovens, often dismissed as weakness or laziness. In reality, they were suffocating in invisible fumes. To stand over a charcoal brazier was to flirt with unconsciousness every day. Peat, dug from bogs and dried into blocks, was another common fuel. It burned with a distinctive smell, earthy and sharp, but it also produced thick smoke loaded with tar and particulates. Cooking with peat meant coating food with a bitter tang while filling lungs with chemicals that scarred them over time. Entire regions relied on it, especially where forest was sparse, and the health effects lingered through generations. Breathing peat smoke was like living inside a permanent haze, the world dimmed by the very fuel that kept you warm. In poorer households, and even some kitchens stretched for fuel, animal dung was pressed into service. Dried into patties, it could be burned as a cheap substitute for wood. The smell was overwhelming, clinging to food, clothes, and skin. Cooking over dung fires meant every meal carried a faint flavour of barnyard. Worse, dung smoke contained dangerous microbes and particulates, spreading disease in the very act of trying to cook. What began as necessity ended as poisoning. The hearth itself was another hazard. Open flames spat sparks, filling kitchens with the constant risk of burns and fires. Chimneys, when they existed, often clogged with soot, spilling smoke back into rooms. In many houses there was no chimney at all, just a hole in the roof. Kitchens doubled as smokehouses, whether intended or not. The air black with haze, eyes streaming, food infused with soot. That soot clung to walls, pots, and utensils, building layers of carcinogens that no one recognized but everyone consumed. Even ash, the byproduct of every fire, found its way into food. It drifted into pots, sprinkled into dough, and coated surfaces. In some places, ash was even used deliberately, mixed with lye to make primitive cleaning solutions or added to salt to stretch supplies. Small amounts might pass unnoticed, but the constant consumption of ash and lye introduced caustic substances into diets already struggling with contamination. Bread baked in communal ovens often carried the taste of ash, its black specks considered normal. Eating soot was simply part of daily life. The constant exposure to smoke and fumes shaped health in ways people never fully understood. Eye infections, persistent coughs, and shortened lifespans were common among cooks and kitchen workers. Women, who spent long hours by the hearth, showed signs of respiratory damage comparable to heavy smokers in later centuries. Children raised in these environments developed lung problems early, their growth stunted by the air they breathed. The hearth, meant to nurture life, chipped away at it slowly, one smoky breath at a time. Beyond health, fuel shaped food itself. Different fuels left distinctive flavours, not always pleasant. A roast cooked over green wood tasted of resin and sap. A pie baked in a peat oven carried a sour tang of bog. Bread left too long in an ashy oven picked up bitterness. Medieval palates grew accustomed to these flavours, but to modern taste they would register as burnt, acrid, or simply foul. Yet these tastes became tradition, proof of authenticity, and part of the identity of the kitchen. Poison disguised itself as flavour, so familiar no one questioned it. You lean close to stir the pot, the smoke thick around your face. your eyes watering as you breathe through a scrap of cloth tied around your mouth. The stew bubbles, ash drifting across its surface, wood resin flavouring the broth whether you wanted it or not. Behind you, a pig snuffles near the waste pile, rats dart in the rushes, and above, soot drips from the ceiling where centuries of fire have blackened the beams. The danger is not just in the meat or the bread, it is in the very air of the kitchen, the invisible seasoning of smoke and fumes that no recipe can leave out. The poisoned fire kept the food warm, but the utensils used to stir, carve and serve it introduced their own risks, carrying disease and contamination with every careless cut. You grip the knife, its edge dull and pitted, and set to carving the roast. Tools should make the work safer, but in the medieval kitchen they only added to the hazards. Every spoon, ladle and cutting board carried its own invisible threats, spreading contamination from one dish to the next long before anyone took a bite. Knives were iron, prone to rust, and difficult to keep sharp. Without stainless steel, every cut left traces of metal, flakes of rust, and microscopic grooves where bacteria settled. Sharpening stones helped, but they also wore the blades unevenly, leaving jagged edges that tore through food instead of slicing cleanly. These cuts exposed meat to faster spoilage, turning a fresh joint of pork into a bacterial playground. Blood and grease clung to the blades, rinsed in cold water but rarely scrubbed with soap, which was expensive and scarce. A knife was less a precise tool than a relic coated with layers of meals past. Wooden spoons and ladles carried their own curse. They absorbed grease, broth, and wine, swelling with moisture until they cracked. Those cracks became homes for bacteria, invisible colonies feeding off every stew and porridge. Without boiling water or soap to cleanse them, spoons became reservoirs of contamination. A ladle dipped into a pot of fish stew one day might stir a pot of porridge the next, blending flavours and bacteria in equal measure. By modern standards, every utensil was a petri dish, yet in the medieval kitchen it was normal, even cherished. Serving dishes made from pewter or wood introduced hazards of their own. Pewter, often mixed with lead, leached toxins into hot food. Wood absorbed sauces and fats, turning rancid over time. The more finely carved and decorated a bowl was, the more tiny crevices it had to trap filth. Washing meant wiping with a cloth, often the same rag used to wipe hands or tables. A dish might look clean enough in the flickering firelight, but under daylight it would reveal layers of grease and stains from years of use. Cutting boards were wooden slabs, scarred deeply from years of chopping. Each groove held remnants of old meals, blood, fat, and mould impossible to scrub out with medieval methods. Cross-contamination was inevitable. Fish cut on Monday shared its essence with bread cut on Tuesday and cheese on Wednesday. By Friday, everything tasted faintly of everything else, including the pathogens. No concept of sanitization existed. To medieval cooks, the smell of old meat or sour fish on the board was simply part of the kitchen's perfume. Communal utensils multiplied the risk. At the table, forks were still rare in much of Europe, considered unnecessary or even decadent. People ate with knives, spoons, and hands, often sharing them. A single serving spoon might pass between guests, dipped into a common bowl again and again, saliva mixing freely with stew. Drinking vessels passed hand to hand, the communal goblet carrying not only wine but every illness in the room. Illness spread invisibly through these rituals of fellowship. Guests thought they were bonding. In reality, they were swapping parasites. Even professional carving carried hazards. At noble feasts, designated carvers performed elaborate cuts before the guests, using long knives to slice meat with flourish. These displays often involved handling raw and cooked meat in quick succession, with no thought of hygiene. Juices splashed onto platters, mixing with bread trenchers and dripping into other dishes. Contamination became part of the spectacle, admired as skill while silently seeding illness into the hall. The absence of soap was perhaps the most dangerous factor of all. Laundry soap existed, made from animal fat and lye, but was harsh and expensive. It was rarely used on kitchen tools. Instead, rinsing with cold water or wiping with a cloth sufficed. Bacteria, parasites, and grease layered over time, building invisible patinas of risk. In monasteries, where strict rules governed cleanliness of spirit, the kitchen still ran on dirty utensils and cloth stiff with old fat. The paradox was striking. Souls were cleansed more often than spoons. You dip a wooden spoon into a pot of stew, watching grease seep from the cracks in its surface. You carve meat with a knife that smells faintly of rust, laying it onto a pewter plate that glimmers with a sheen of lead. The serving spoon passes from hand to hand, dipped into mouths and back into the pot, until the entire table has shared more than just food. To modernize it is grotesque, but to medieval diners it was fellowship, hospitality and tradition. Poison wrapped itself in ritual, disguised as normality. The utensils, tools and boards of the medieval kitchen ensured that even if food began clean, it rarely stayed that way. Every stir, every cut, every serving was another chance for sickness to spread. Cooks prided themselves on their skill, but the tools betrayed them, turning meals into vectors of disease with every touch. And as you wipe the knife on your apron, knowing it will carve again tomorrow with the same invisible residue, you sense the next layer of danger creeping in. For beyond the tools themselves lies the human hand, the ultimate utensil carrying every sickness and stain directly into the meal. You wipe your hands on your apron, streaks of grease and flour smearing into the fabric, and reach back into the pot. No gloves, no soap, no thought of what you've just touched. The truth is, the most dangerous tool in the medieval kitchen was not the knife or the spoon. It was the human hand, always present, always busy, and always filthy. Soap did exist, but not in the way you know it. Early soap was made from animal fat and lye, harsh on skin and expensive to make. It was used more for washing clothes than for washing hands. In kitchens, washing usually meant a quick dip in cold water, sometimes shared, often dirty by the time multiple hands went through it. Some cooks wiped their hands on cloths, on their aprons, or simply on their trousers, then went back to kneading dough or basting roasts. Grease and grime were layered into every step of the cooking process, carried invisibly by hands that never truly came clean. Fingernails were another hazard. Long, untrimmed, and rarely scrubbed, they trapped dirt, fat, and parasites. Archaeological studies of latrines from the medieval period reveal parasite eggs from roundworms, whipworms, and tapeworms in abundance. Those same eggs clung under fingernails, passed from the privy to the pantry in one careless moment. A cook kneading bread might add more than yeast to the dough, and no one the wiser. Illness spread invisibly through nails as much as through rats. The habit of communal eating worsened the risks. Guests ate with their hands, tearing meat, dipping trenchers into stews, and licking fingers before reaching again. Even when spoons were used, they were often shared. The idea of germs did not exist. What mattered was showing generosity and fellowship, which meant touching food, passing it directly, and sharing dishes. A cook's hands, already coated in filth, were only the beginning. Every guest became part of the contamination chain. In noble households, rituals of hand-washing before meals gave the illusion of cleanliness. Basins were brought out, water poured over fingers, and towels offered. But the water was reused, the basins rarely scrubbed, and the towels handled by dozens of hands. It was more performance than sanitation, a show of refinement without substance. By the time the meal began, fingers were no cleaner than before, and food was handled freely, each bite carrying the residue of everyone who touched it. The kitchen environment itself added to the contamination. Cooks handled raw meat, then bread, then cheese, without any division of labour. Blood from a chicken mingled with dough for the evening's loaves. Fish scales stuck to fingers that later arranged delicate pastries. There were no cutting boards for different ingredients, no sense of separation. One pair of hands prepared everything, spreading bacteria from one food to the next in a continuous loop of invisible exchange. Bodily habits only amplified the danger. Sneezing or coughing into hands was common, followed by immediate contact with food. Wounds were frequent among cooks, from cuts, burns, and blisters, and these open sores became sources of contamination. A cook might keep working with a bandaged hand, the cloth already soaked through, dipping into broth or dough as though nothing were wrong. Infection spread silently, seasoning meals with the bacteria of the very people who prepared them. Servants and apprentices often lived in the kitchens they worked in, sleeping on straw beds near the hearth, surrounded by animals and vermin. Hygiene was an afterthought. Lice, fleas, and scabs were common, and these too travelled on hands into the food. A loaf of bread carried not only flour and yeast, but traces of the bodies who made it. Kitchens were breeding grounds not just for recipes, but for disease cultures hidden beneath fingernails. Physicians occasionally warned of the dangers of filth, though not in modern terms. Some texts advised cooks to keep themselves tidy, not out of concern for germs, but to present a more respectable appearance. Others recommended washing hands in vinegar or wine, which may have killed some bacteria but was used more sparingly than it should have been. For the most part, cleanliness was symbolic, a ritual of appearances, not a practical defence against sickness. You plunge your bare hands into a bowl of dough, kneading it until it clings to your skin, then turn immediately to slice salted pork with the same fingers. The smell of sweat, smoke, and grease clings to you as much as to the food. You wipe your brow, smear it across the bread, and carry on. To you it feels natural. To your guests it feels generous. But to your stomach it is an ambush. The hand that fed you also poisoned you, invisibly and relentlessly. Hands were the bridge between every hazard of the medieval kitchen. They carried parasites from the privy, bacteria from raw meat, lead from pewter dishes, soot from the fire, and mould from damp bread. They touched everything, connected everything, and ensured that no poison remained isolated. In the end, the greatest risk in the medieval kitchen was not what went into the pot, but who stirred it, served it, and ate it with bare fingers. And as you lick grease from your own hand, exhausted after hours at the fire, you realise the danger does not end here. For the chef's body itself, weary and underfed, is a breeding ground for sickness that could be carried straight into the food long before anyone took a single bite. You stand over the fire, your skin sticky with sweat, your body aching from hours of chopping, hauling and stirring. The air is thick with smoke, your lungs tight from years of breathing in soot and ash. Every cough you release drifts into the food you prepare, invisible particles sprinkling into the stew. In the medieval kitchen, it was not only the food itself that poisoned you. The chef's own body was a vessel of contamination, spreading sickness with every movement, breath and wheeze. Cooks were rarely healthy people. Most lived in crowded, smoky spaces, sleeping near the same hearth where they worked. Respiratory illnesses were common. Chronic coughing, wheezing, and spitting into the fire were everyday sounds. Tuberculosis, known at the time as consumption, thrived in these conditions. It caused lingering coughs that produced bloody sputum. Imagine a chef leaning over a bubbling cauldron, hacking into it between stirs. Nobody understood germs, so no one thought twice. The soup was flavoured with more than herbs. Malnutrition compounded the problem. Many cooks ate scraps, leftovers, and whatever they could sneak without being noticed. Their diets were rarely balanced, leaving them deficient in vital nutrients. Scurvy was not only for sailors. Vitamin C deficiency led to swollen gums, loose teeth, and bleeding sores. A cook with bleeding gums might drool into the food without realising. Open sores on the skin could leak pus, especially if covered poorly with a rag. The chef's body became a silent ingredient mixed into every dish. Injuries were routine in the kitchen. Burns from hot oil, cuts from knives, and blisters from hauling pots left constant wounds. There were no antiseptics. A burn might fester, oozing fluids as the cook continued to work. Bandages, if used, were strips of dirty cloth that only spread infection further. Some wounds became septic, filling with gangrene. Still, work never stopped. Food had to be prepared, no matter the condition of the chef. The kitchen was less a place of nourishment and more a petri dish disguised as a workplace. Parasites thrived in this environment. Many cooks carried lice, fleas, and intestinal worms. Without soap or medicine, these parasites were impossible to eliminate. Worms caused stomach cramps, diarrhea, and bloating, but they also laid eggs that passed out of the body. Those eggs could cling to clothing, to hands, or even drift invisibly into food. Archaeological studies of medieval remains reveal high parasite loads, meaning nearly everyone carried them. When your chef sneezed into your stew, you were not just eating pepper and meat. You were swallowing eggs of worms passed down from countless generations of cooks before. Exhaustion also played its part. Kitchens ran nearly all day. Fires had to be maintained constantly. Meals for nobles or soldiers required massive amounts of preparation. Cooks rose before dawn and often worked until late into the night. Fatigue made them careless. A tired hand stirred with less precision. A weary mind forgot which meat had spoiled and which was safe. Fatigue led to mistakes, and mistakes in a medieval kitchen could be fatal. Rotten meat might slip through, moldy bread might be served, and no one noticed until stomachs churned. The chef's sweat was a constant contaminant. It dripped into food as they leaned over pots, stirred broths, or roasted meat. Sweat carried salts, dirt, and bacteria. It was unavoidable in a smoky, overheated kitchen. Combined with already unsanitary conditions, it ensured that every dish carried traces of the chef's body. In a sense, meals were flavoured not just with spices, but with the very essence of the cook who made them. Disease outbreaks often trace back to kitchens. When one cook fell ill, everyone eating their food was at risk. Dysentery spread through water and food handled by the sick. Typhoid fever, caused by contaminated food or drink, thrived in these environments. In the modern age, Typhoid Mary became infamous for spreading disease as a cook. But in the medieval world, nearly every cook was a Typhoid Mary, only without a name or recognition. Their illnesses spread silently, woven into the fabric of every feast. The irony was sharp. Nobles might demand elaborate banquets, filled with roasted meats, spiced dishes, and sweet pastries. They would eat off silver plates, drink from goblets of pewter, and enjoy entertainment while they dined. Yet behind the curtain, their meals were prepared by coughing, sweating, bleeding cooks, whose own bodies contaminated everything. The more elaborate the meal, the more hands and bodies contributed to its invisible dangers. Luxury was not a defense against filth. Even religious institutions, which prided themselves on order and cleanliness, suffered the same problems. Monastic kitchens were run by brothers who lived communally, often plagued with lice, worms, and skin conditions. They prepared simple stews, breads, and cheeses, yet the same contamination occurred. Sacred prayers were whispered over meals, but they could not sanctify away the reality of disease carried directly from body to food. Faith did not sterilize the kitchen. You cough into your sleeve, wipe your nose on your apron, and go back to stirring the pot. You think nothing of it. No one around you thinks anything of it either. Yet the pot carries more than stew. It carries your illness, your sweat, your parasites, your exhaustion, and your slow decay. In every medieval kitchen, the chef themselves was as poisonous as the food they cooked. If you enjoyed this delightful plunge into historical suffering, make sure to check out the other videos waiting for you. There's no shortage of misery to drift off to. And hey, let me know down in the comments which catastrophe of the past you'd like me to ruin your dreams with next.